Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, April 16th, 2009. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, homebrewers Jim Lewellyn and Darren Goad join us to talk about their recent experiment brewing variations on an American Pale Ale. Jim and Darren played with yeast and dry hopping and shared their results with us. If you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And you can follow me on Twitter, my username, Basic Brewing, all one word. You can also find me on Facebook. My username there is Basic Brewing James. And we also have a Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing Video page on Facebook. And if you become a fan of the show there, you'll be getting occasional notices when I post podcasts. Every week you know that you're going to get one of these, but the video podcasts, are every couple of weeks or so, and there's not a regular schedule, so it may be nice to get an update through Facebook so that you can check to see if new episodes are out there. Our 2009 Brewers logbooks are still in stock, still going out the door. We appreciate that. You can check them out on our online store, basicbrewingshop.com. Don't brew without it. And thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you the show, and we appreciate your support. This past weekend, I racked half of my extract wheat beer to secondary as part of the Basic Brewing Radio Brew Your Own Magazine collaborative experiment. I also bottled a handful of beers out of the primary, out of that batch. And more importantly, the online forum where you can report the results of your experiment is now live. You can see that at basicbrewing.com/experiment. And you can also find a PDF there that you can download and print to help you keep track of your data as your experiment progresses. My little wheat beer is pretty bland, frankly, but I kind of planned it that way because I want to see if there is any detectable difference in the yeast and leaving the beer on the yeast for a longer time. So anyway, I appreciate everybody who's participating in our BBR-BYO experiment. I've got no idea how many are participating, but I hope we get a good number of you. For those of you just joining the conversation, the experiment is to test what impact, if any, leaving a beer on the primary yeast for an additional 2 weeks has on the flavor and gravity or any other characteristics that we can detect. And we'll be sharing the results of the experiment here on this show and in Brew Your Own. So if you participate, you'll have a chance to get your name in print in the magazine. The deadline is May 15th. And by the way, Ron from Tulsa had some suggestions for names for the experiment. Homebrewers Collective Experiment, the Homebrewers Collaboration Experiment, or Homebrewers Quest for Truth Experiment. kind of like the ring of that one. Or he says you can replace homebrewers with the word brewers. So Brewers Collective Experiment, Brewers Collaboration Experiment, or the Brewers Quest for Truth Experiment. Thanks, Ron. If you have suggestions for a name for the experiment, drop me a line. You can do so at james@basicbrewing.com, or just use the contact form at basicbrewing.com. Or you can use Twitter or Facebook, too. It's chilly here in the studio this morning. I'm having trouble talking. The American Homebrewers Association Big Brew is coming up on Saturday, May 2nd, in celebration of National Homebrew Day. Homebrewers across the country and around the world are planning events to observe that day, the Big Brew Day. If you want to learn more about how you can take part, go to beertown.org. That's the Brewers Association and AHA site. Remember, Big Brew on May 2nd. Oh, and I forgot to mention this at the top of the show last week. On basicbrewing.com, there's now an associate link for the AHA. So now you can join the American Homebrewers Association through the ad on our site, and you'll be supporting both the AHA and us. How cool is that? You'll be getting a subscription to Zymergy magazine as a part of your membership. So very cool. Got some good comments on the past 2 episodes on the brew in a bag technique. Several of you are very curious about trying it yourself. And also I got pretty good feedback about my brewing solo and recording it last week. One listener advised that it was passable, but he asked not to make a habit of it. And I have to agree. Not even I like to listen to myself that much. Plus, I always enjoy hearing what others think about the brewing process, and I love the collaborative effort whenever we record with, at least a couple of us around the brew pot. But here's one fun comment from Chris in Great Neck, New York, about last week's show. He says, as I was walking down Fifth Avenue in New York, I came to the part of the show where you mentioned bacon-flavored mayonnaise and started to laugh. All I could think about was Homer Simpson saying, bacon mayonnaise. Baconaise. See what you're missing if you don't listen all the way to the end? You never know what people will buy on Amazon. Good news coming from West Virginia, by the way. The bill to raise the alcohol by volume limit from 6 to 12% is apparently awaiting the governor's signature. So, and it's fairly assured, as I hear and read, that he will sign that. So, if so, congratulations to West Virginia beer lovers. Have some Belgians, some good high-gravity beers. Now let's get on to the interview. Jim Lewellyn and Darren Goad are not just any ordinary homebrewers. Jim is a microbiologist, and Darren is a chemist. So when Jim and Darren approached me with the results of an experiment that they did with an American Pale Ale, I thought it would be a fun conversation. Well, Jim Lewellyn and Darren Goad, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Great to be here.
Hi, James. It's great to be here.
Well, let's start off, number one, so we can get your voices differentiated, and number two, so we can learn a little bit about you guys. Jim, tell me where you are and what you do for a living.
Well, I live in Cincinnati, Ohio. Most of your listeners should be pretty familiar with that, given that the Homebrew Conference was here just last year. For a living, I work for a pretty large consumer goods company, and I work in research and development, specifically in product development for them. My background, which is kind of how we got involved with homebrewing, I guess you could say, I was a microbiology major in school, and the way I actually got involved with homebrewing was kind of ironic because I was one of the yellow beer drinkers before I brewed my first batch of homebrew, and I was actually didn't care for any kind of beer other than Miller Lite. And my senior year of as a microbiology major, my professor was a home brewer, and our very last class, he spoke to us about home brewing. And probably about 2 weeks after that last lecture, I purchased my first equipment and started home brewing. So looking back, I'm surprised I ever stuck with it, given my taste at the time. But about 6 years later, here I am.
Well, awesome. Well, that's an educator taking his work seriously and doing some good work, in my opinion. Darren, what about you?
Well, I currently live in northern Kentucky, just south of Cincinnati. I work for the same consumer goods company Jim does. I am currently now doing more of a process engineering role, but my background is chemistry. I've done that the last 5 years with this company. And actually, Jim brought me into the home brewing field, I guess you could say, about a year ago. So I'm fairly new to home brewing, but I really dove into it full force, as you could say, listened to all the podcasts and everything out there. So,
what brought you guys to thinking of doing an experiment? I mean, you guys are kind of scientists by trade. It seems like a lot of us don't want to do what we do for a living when we get home, but you guys, I guess, wanted to apply some of your scientific background to your home brewing. How did that come about?
we were taking turns essentially brewing with each other's own equipment. And after we had done a couple different batches together, we just kind of looked at each other and like, why don't we try to learn something from this? So I don't think, at least my intentions wasn't to start out getting too science nerdy with this. And I think our first experiment, we in my opinion, didn't go over the top. We decided to start pretty basic. And given that we were both doing all grain, Darren has the ability to do 10-gallon batches. We thought it was fairly easy to do a 10-gallon batch. And split those into two different fractions, which we would then go through different, at that time we were thinking potentially different fermentation processes, et cetera. And that's kind of how it evolved. The actual recipe that we used was one that Darren had brewed previously, and he had a desire to tweak it a little bit, try to improve it from the last batch, and things just kind of started snowballing from that point.
Well, Darren, tell us about your system.
My system currently is 3 half-barrel system. So basically, took the normal 3 half barrels and made them into kettles. Boil kettle, hot liquor tank, mash tun. The mash tun is actually insulated, where I was able to find an old 50 drum heating insulator. I was able to insulate that to keep the temperature constant as much as I could. From there, just additional, brew store purchases, stainless steel, false bottom, sparge arm, things like that, all the necessities. So I enjoyed that part of it mostly. We're all tinkerers. We want to, everybody wants to improve on everybody's equipment. So I enjoyed that part.
And Jim, you don't have as fancy a system?
No, Darren kind of downplayed a little bit his interest in setting up his system. Darren does have he has a nicer system than I do. I just have a 7.5 gallon stainless steel kettles for my boil kettle, and my MLT and HLT I have 10-gallon igloo coolers. So that's how I kind of addressed my the need to insulate for what I was using it for. But because of the capacity of those igloo coolers, I only do 5-gallon batches, or at least because of the capacity of my boil kettle. So we have similar setups. We both have immersion chillers, just the sheer capacity differences between the two setups that we have. And he's got a nice little scaffolding set that we set all this stuff on. So we kind of default his setup.
Well, Jim, you and I are probably on a closer wavelength than Darren and I. And there's everybody's got their own way of doing things, as long as you get good beer in the end, right?
Yep,
that's correct.
Well, this experiment should strike a note close to most of our listeners' heart. This is an American Pale Ale experiment, and you're testing a couple of different things in this one, right?
I wanted the most bang for our buck when we're doing an experiment. There's many different ways we could approach this. So we try to keep as many parameters constant, but get the largest difference we could see by only adjusting 1 or 2. And those 2 we decided on was yeast strain and dry hopping varieties. So during the experiment, we brewed a 10-gallon batch, completely the same recipe, same bittering, flavoring, aroma hops. And then after that is when the experiment started.
So first of all, tell us about the recipe.
All right. Well, for the recipe, like I mentioned before, this was one of Darren's recipes that we've kind of modified over the different batches that we've brewed with this. As far as the recipe breakdown, we went with 87.9% pale malt, 4.4% crystal 20L, 4.4% Munich malts, 2.2% victory malt, and 1.1% crystal 40L. So again, we tried to keep that pretty basic. What we did modify on this particular grain bill from the previous recipe was we did some balancing with the crystal, tried to get the color a little bit lower, and just try to improve the overall flavor of this APA that we had brewed once before. As far as hops, we stuck with what we felt like was a fairly basic hop schedule. For bittering hops, we went with 1 ounce of Magnum. The Magnum that we did use was at 13.1% alpha acid, and we were targeting 60-minute boil time for that bittering hop. For flavoring hops, we went with 2 ounces of Cascade, and our Cascade was at 6.3% alpha acid, and we were targeting 15 minutes of boil time for that. And then for aroma hop addition, we went again with Cascade. We picked 2 ounces of Cascade hops. It was actually the same hop, so our alpha acids remained at 6.3%. And we actually wanted to add that at flame out to try to retain as much as that aroma as we could. So that's what we went with. And like I said earlier, kind of as our ideas started to snowball as far as what do we do and how do we, go about this particular experiment. One of the things that I ran into several times, especially given some of the hop shortages that we've had, is you may come up with a recipe, take it to the homebrew shop, and you find that, they don't have either the yeast strain that you were looking for, they were out, or, more recently, some of the hop varietals that we were looking for might not have been available. So we were actually lucky enough to have Cascade, which I think is, in my opinion, probably a pretty good hop choice for an APA. So we didn't particularly run into that problem with this particular experiment. But
actually, just let me
Sure.
it up. We actually was supposed to be a mixture of Cascade and Centennial at each edition, 1 ounce of each. But as you said, they were out of Centennial, so we went with straight Cascade on the hop editions. So.
Well, you can't go wrong with Cascade, in my opinion. So.
Yep. And then so where really the experiment started to pick up, since we went with the same grain bill and hop schedule, was, as Darren said, after the wort was made. So where we actually started our experiment was on the dry hopping, which we had done previously. And we also, the experiment started then also with the yeast strains that we chose. So one of the other things that I think many homebrewers are confronted with is when they go to their local homebrew shop is, they have a recipe in mind. They either don't have the yeast strain available, or, they're kind of battling in their minds. Do I go with this white lab strain, or do I go with this Y yeast strain? Or, maybe if they have a favorite between brands, say they favor white labs, there's several different types. It would all be pretty good choices for the style of beer they're making. So that's where Darren and I kind of split off, and we decided to each take a different hop varietal to dry hop with, and we each took a different yeast strain to do our primary fermentation with.
The yeast strains, if I were designing this experiment, I would have gotten a little more adventurous and, put like a Belgian against, something more exotic on the other end of the scale. But you guys chose to do what is supposed to be, or at least what I've heard, is supposed to be the same version of the yeast strain from each manufacturer. You chose the American Ale strain, the 1056 from Y Yeast, and the California Ale strain, the 001 from White Labs, which I've heard it referred to as the Chico strain. Is that right?
That's correct. We're kind of laughing because I think that both we took that through our minds. How extreme do we want to make this experiment? At least speaking for myself, I think by nature we're fairly conservative people, especially given our backgrounds with our whole science and engineering backgrounds. So in one regard, I did have a interest in really kind of testing the limits with this. But then on the other side, the conservative side of me, it was, let's keep it basic. Let's, not get too crazy, still create an IPA, or excuse me, an APA. And let's just look at what some of the classic strain choices for that style can show us as far as flavor differences.
Yeah, when I looked at it and thought about it, this is actually a better experiment than comparing two very different yeast strains from different ends of the spectrum. Did you use starters with these yeasts?
No, we did not. We do not currently have the equipment. It's funny to say we don't have the equipment to make a sufficient starter at the moment. So that's the next purchase on my list, especially when our last batch, we just did our first lager. So we were struggling with the extra amount of yeast needed for a lagering experiment.
But you've got access to growlers, don't you?
Yes.
We do. What he's talking about is a stir plate.
Yeah.
I want all the high-tech equipment.
Yeah, I was going to say, I make starters all the time, Darren, and I don't have a lab full of stuff. So,
With Darren and his equipment, it's go hard or go home for him. So there's been a lot of research on different stir plates and whatnot. So it'll be interesting to see what he ends up with.
And I'm sure there'll be lovely starters when you get around to making them.
They'll outperform.
But but right now you have no starter, Darren. So
I guess that is true. Yeah. Point.
What size of a pouch did you get for the Y yeast?
It was the smack pack, so I believe it was the larger version.
So I assume that they both were within the date range specified, freshness date range.
That was actually one of the things that, again, kind of going back to our particular backgrounds and being probably a little bit more anal than what we need to be. We were the guys in the homebrew shop digging through the stash of yeast and looking for the born-on dates or expiration dates to try to find the youngest yeast. So we both picked the yeast that for the two different strains that was the youngest that was available. And for the Y yeast, the activator packs that we had was 100 billion yeast cells, or at least what they project to be 100 billion yeast cells when activated.
So how did the fermentation go? What was your gravity when you started, and what did you end at, and what did you observe in between?
The starting gravity was 1054. Throughout the process, we noticed that the Y yeast started, I guess you could say, was active sooner than the White Labs California ale yeast. And I've seen that multiple times because basically the activator or smack packs are basically a little starter compared to the vials.
And I've seen the same thing as well. Typically when I pitch with the White Labs vial, it's usually about a day delayed from my experience. And again, that was never really documented as well as what we try to do with this particular recipe. But as Darren said, there was about a day lag between the two different strains that we use, and I think we both kind of attributed that just to the nutrient pack that is in the Y yeast bag.
But once they both started going, did they have a similar performance?
Yes, yeah, both performed exactly the same, same amount of Croizin and all that. Both ended up final gravities at 1011. So,
and as far as back to the experiment, trying to be the lab coat, if you will. One of the things that we did end up fermenting these here at Darren's house, and the reason why we chose that route is you hear a lot or read about, or maybe you just wonder about different fermentation temperatures. So I typically ferment mine in the basement, which will have steady temperatures but may differ from, say, Darren's place. So Darren has a refrigerator that he converted over with a Renko temperature controller. So what we did do with these, despite having slightly different yeast strains, or at least manufacturers, and the lag between the two different strains that we did use, one of the things we did to kind of mitigate any differences through the fermentation process was to keep those in that temperature-controlled refrigerator. And what we did, as we monitored those throughout the fermentation process, when we initially put those into the refrigerator, it started out at 62 degrees Fahrenheit the first day, and we saw a slow ramp up to 63 degrees Fahrenheit on the second day. And by the third day and throughout the remainder of the fermentation, it leveled off at 64 degrees Fahrenheit.
It should be a fairly clean fermentation then, as far as the fruity esters and all.
Right, we were hoping so. We did brew this the day that we brewed this. It was in December, so it was pretty cold outside. And actually, from one of your previous podcasts about brewing in the garage, so I hope no one yells at us.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. We did have the windows cracked and the garage door cracked when throughout the brewing process, but it was still a little chilly.
I was a big old hypocrite and brewed in the garage this past weekend, so, you know. But my door was all the way open. So the fermentation, once it got started, was the same. And at least on paper, both yeasts performed the same. Then what did you do after that? Where'd you go from there?
This is where the second part of our experiment, or at least test conditions, began. And what we did from that point was our dry hopping. So, as I said, we've all dry hopped in the past and really wanted to do something somewhat controlled so that we can really see the effects that the dry hopping had on the different yeast strains and recipe that we decided to brew. So again, trying to be somewhat controlled, we did want to do something similar to what each of us were, Darren and I were doing. So what we did is we took the 5-gallon batches that were each fermented using a different yeast strain, and we then split those and fractioned them into two. So we each had 2.5-gallon beers at that point. And what we did was we took one of those 2.5-gallon fractions and we left it unchanged. So we just transferred it and to the second 2.5-gallon fraction from each yeast strain, we each added or dry hopped using a different hop varietal. And what we did at that point is Darren went with the Cascade hop variety that we used in our hop schedule during the brew day, and I went with a Columbus hops. So again, a little bit different. The Columbus hops was higher alpha acid level, so that was at a 12.2%. So at that point, then we had 4 different beers, one control for each yeast strain we chose, and then one test condition using a different hop varietal, and we kept them in the same fermentation conditions, and we let them run out through different periods of time. And again, going back to what you had mentioned earlier, as far as how do we keep these consistent as we're doing this experiment? One thing that we did try to do and not become too anal with the experiment is we tried to fall back to a little bit more loose homebrewer style, where we really kind of read what the beer was doing as opposed to being very strict on the time of fermentation or time of dry hopping. So what we were just talking about with the primary fermentation, we did watch what the Kreuzen was doing and watching the bubbling and things like that before we transferred them into the secondary. And then for the dry hopping process, we did the same thing. Had about a day difference between the two based off of what we were seeing activity-wise in the secondary fermentation. And I guess one other point of difference that we did have with the secondary fermentation is I transferred mine into two 3-gallon better bottles, and Darren transferred his into 2 5-gallon corny kegs. So a little bit different vessels, plastic versus stainless steel. So again, I guess going back and critiquing what we did, that could be a point of difference for the two beers, but just kind of went with what we had and tried not to be too anal with what we were doing.
Well, and both were left at 64 degrees Fahrenheit during that time, right? So the temperature was the same, it's just the vessels were different.
Correct. The vessels were what varied. Temperature was the same. We both, as far as the dry hopping, we put them in the muslin bags and sunk them with marbles. So something I think pretty typical for what a lot of other homebrewers are out there doing with their dry hopping technique. But temperature did remain the same. Just vessels were the only thing different at that point.
The primary fermentation was, fully complete. So once we hit the secondary, there wasn't really much activity in the secondary because I was in corny, so I couldn't actually observe any. So we took more of the alpha acid content for the hop varieties on the length of time we were going to dry hop. I've heard on many podcasts or some podcasts, the higher alpha acid doesn't need as long to dry hop. which could lead, the longer a higher alcohol acid is dry hop, could lead to more of the greener notes, and we try to prevent that. So we pulled Jim's out a little sooner than mine.
And then what about packaging? What'd you do there?
For packaging, I was already in corny, so I was ready to go. All I did was force carbonate, and then wait till it was force carbonated, and then started drinking.
We heard somewhere down the homebrewing road that it takes beer to make beer, so we hold pretty tight to that and try not to stray away from that piece too much. As far as my fractions, I took those back to my place, so I took them back to Cincinnati, and in my head I was kind of battling: do I do priming sugar or do I do a DME? I've done both in the past, and I was kind of battling exactly how do I want to bottle condition these. And initially we did talk about bottle conditioning all of them, so that if we needed to send them or just carry them around, it was a little bit easier to do than hauling around the corny kegs. So I went ahead and bottled mine, but on the day of bottling, I got a little bit too excited, I guess you could say, and I started transferring my beer from the secondaries into bottles, and probably about a dozen or so bottles into it, I realized that I forgot to add my priming sugar. And it turns out that's usually pretty important when you're bottle conditioning. So I was somewhat panicked and thinking, here's a month or two's worth of work just completely out the window. What am I going to do with this mess at this point? But luckily I had some Mutton's carb tabs in my little brew box, and I had never used those before, and I had them sitting in there. So at that point, I already had some of the beer, like I said, probably about 12 bottles worth filled. So I thought that was the best thing to do, as opposed to leaving the beer sit while I run to go get some either DME or some priming sugar, or I guess the other option I went through at that point in time was putting it back into the secondary. But I was kind of hesitant in doing that, only because I didn't want to introduce any more oxygen to the beer than I had to. So it was easy to drop those tabs in. I was, like I said, extremely worried at that time because I'd never used those before. But given the mess up or the snafu that I did have, I thought that was the best route to take, at least at that point in time. So I went ahead and bottle conditioned my 2.5 gallon test conditions using the Mutton's carb tabs.
Now, I know right now that there are a couple of listeners that are typing an email to me even now, saying that this experiment is skewed because one half of the experiment is bottled and bottle conditioned, and the other half is kegged. So as scientists, how do you defend yourself?
I guess as far as the experimental design, I'm the one that deviated from the experimental design in that I chose to bottle condition mine when I have the ability to force carbonate. So I have many corny kegs, and knowing that Darren had already at that point in time was force carbonating his, I should have, looking back in hindsight, force carbonated mine. But for just ease of transferring beer around, taking it to different friends' houses or whatnot, I went ahead and decided to go ahead and bottle condition mine. So again, for your listeners who will write in and say, this experiment is skewed, I can't necessarily disagree with them as far as that this introduces another variable to the experiment. Having said from the very beginning, we wanted to minimize as many of the variables as we could, but I think that's something that's very real world as far as the homebrewers face, where on some batches you might force carbonate, other batches you might bottle condition. Or hopefully there's some other people out there that are listening that have went through the same snafu that I did, where you get too excited and simply forgot to add your conditioning sugar. So in one hand, I guess it opens ourselves up to potentially revisiting this experiment and doing another experiment. And in that second experiment, if we would do one of this APA, I think one of the things that we would probably try to minimize as variables introduced is not conditioning or carbonating different ways. And ironically enough, through this first experiment that we did do, We have since brewed a second experiment where we were testing some other parameters, I guess you could say. So it just opens up the opportunity and more question. And I guess back to the science piece, that's the whole part of science is finding out new things from the data that you have gathered and retesting based off your learnings.
So in your opinion, before we get to the observations, in your opinion, did the different methods of carbonation have an impact or have a potential to have an impact on what you observed?
It could have a slight impact, but since there are yeast strains, the only difference would be yeast strain because I'm carbonating with pure CO2. So, and then Jim would be actually awakening that yeast again to produce the CO2. That would be the only difference. And since our yeast strains were similar, I don't think I don't think any off flavors or anything like that was contributed to carbonation level.
Let's get to the chase. What did you guys taste and observe from these beers?
Well, I think from initial tasting, I think we were both somewhat surprised in how different the initial flavor profile was of the beers, simply from the two different yeast strains. So this was simply tasting our controls. So, again, same grain bill, same hop schedule, and the only differences were the yeast strains that we used to ferment. And I'll let Darren speak to this, but I was quite surprised in how different the flavor profiles were. I expected the control batches or conditions, if you will, to be pretty similar and really indistinguishable, at least to my tongue, given that I'm not a BJCP exam person certified whatnot. So I was surprised initially in the flavor differences between the two controls.
I agree. I don't have much more to say than that. It was surprising. I'm trying to look at our notes again.
I think maybe just to build a little bit more on what exactly we did taste with the California ale yeast, so the White Labs, the vial. One of the things that I think that we both, as we were tasting these side by side and kind of looked at each other and started nodding, is with the White Labs yeast, a lot more of the sweet malty notes really came through compared to the Y yeast strain. And again, one thing I should maybe just state before we get too far into our tasting notes, a lot of these differences that we're going to state, I don't think these are not off flavors or bad differences. It's just plain differences. So we'll speak of them in the absolute, I guess. But with the White Lab strain, I think we both saw a lot more of the sweet notes coming out from the malt, and it seemed to enhance the kind of the background hop flavor that from our hop schedule, with the bittering hops and flavor and aroma hops. So it seemed like we got a little bit more of that hop character come through in the control versus the Y yeast. On the other hand, the Y yeast, again, not a bad tasting at all. But I think one of the things that kind of jumped out to us is the Y yeast, the 1056 American Ale, really seemed a lot more crisp and cleaner. So we didn't have that sweet kind of caramely malt note that we got off of the White Lab strain. But what the Y yeast had to offer was really that clean, crisp flavor that I feel like we both kind of came to the consensus that it accented the malt and hop notes, but not nearly to the extent of what the White Lab strain did.
And it would be interesting to do a similar experiment with identical packaging, so that would take that variable completely out of the equation. But I was surprised in reading the results that there was any difference at all.
Yep. And I guess one other thing to build on that, one thing that I noticed, because I still have my two test conditions sitting around. One thing that I did notice, and now I wish Darren didn't drink as quite as fast as I did. I wish we can go back and taste them again, because as they age, because when we tasted these, we were both pretty darn eager to see what our experiment results were. We started tasting them as they were still pretty young or green, and they weren't bad beers by any means. They were very drinkable, so drinkable that Darren drank all of his. But as I went back to mine, and I'm somewhat of a pack rat, as I went back to mine that I had been hoarding in the basement, as I tasted them more and more, and potentially this is just the cumulative effects where I get a little bit sensitized to the beer maybe, but I thought some of those notes that I remembered from Darren's beer somewhat became a little bit more muted in my beer, the White Labs strain test, as the beer aged. Again, and it wasn't a bad thing, and in hindsight, I wish we would have saved a little bit more so that we could come back to it again and see if there really is a difference or if it's just a figment of my imagination.
Now, on the control versus the dry hop, here we have side-by-side comparisons that I don't think we can argue about as much as far as the change in the variables because you do have the same conditions on each half of your half.
Sure.
So what did you notice in the difference between the control and the dry hop between each of these batches?
This is really our second kind of eureka moment, I guess, as far as the dry hopping, because we had such a controlled experiment up into this point. Visually, there was a huge difference in head retention. I would say probably about a 3x difference pouring the two beers side by side. And this is both for the White Lab strain, which was Darren's, the White Lab strain was my experiment, and Darren's Y yeast strain. And again, the only difference that we were looking at that point was the two different hop varietals. Huge impact on head retention, and it was very noticeable, almost to the point where it looked like our non-dry hopped test conditions really almost looked a little bit undercarbonated and on a side-by-side comparison because of the head differences.
Huh.
So I think that was the first thing that we really, just visually looking at the beer jumped out at us. Other things that we noticed, obviously you're going to have a good hop aroma, at least that the hop heads are seeking. And regardless of the varietal chosen, Cascade or Columbus, you had that really good just hop citrusy note hit you as soon as you took your pint to your nose. So that was something that we were looking for, not necessarily surprising, but what I guess is expected of the dry hop versions. The other thing I think for both of us, and I think I'm more of a hop head than Darren, I think that both dry hop versions we preferred, regardless of the hop varietal chosen. So I naturally default to anything that's hoppy. Darren, I think, is probably less so than myself, but tasting these four different beers that we had at this point, all side by side, we both gravitated towards the dry hop versions. And I think we both felt as if those were more true to the APA, or at least APA style, or what we expected out of the APA. I guess having said that, the non-dry hop versions, again, were not bad beers, but definitely very light on the hop side.
Did you see any difference in the color or clarity?
No, I don't believe we didn't see any difference in clarity. We did see some additional sediment in the hop variety. That could have been due to the dry hopping, but they were in muslin bank, so I'm not sure. That could have just been how we bottled or keg conditioned. Between
the Columbus and the Cascade, what did you perceive in differences?
For me, this was another kind of a little bit of a surprise. I was in the homebrew store. I was a little disappointed that I didn't get the Cascade hops because being a hop head, I really wanted the Cascade, and Darren was the one that grabbed that. But from things that I've read as far as Cascade hops, and maybe it's just my ignorance or lack of research, the Cascade is really typically what it provided, or at least flavor profile, had given the good citrusy notes, a little bit of pine, potentially some grapefruit notes. And tasting the two side by side, the two dry hop beers, the Columbus and the Cascade, we saw a huge difference in flavor, and we saw a dramatic difference in the citrus or piney notes in the Columbus dry hop version. So that was a little bit of a surprise for me, because I expected to see more of that in the Cascade dry hop beer. I guess one thing, kind of looking back on how we went about this, we did use two significantly different hops with significantly different alpha acid levels.
Time could have.
Yeah, so time definitely was something that could have impacted this. As Darren said earlier, we did cut short the Columbus. I think it was only by a day. And what we were really worried about more than anything was getting some of that grassy note into our beers by leaving that dry hop on the beer too long. Mm-hmm. So we didn't leave them on there that long, and maybe you or some of your listeners would say that 4 days is more than enough. I know in the past when I dry hopped, I've left them on for longer and didn't pick up the grassy notes, but I didn't want to have that happen on this particular experiment. But given for face value what we did do, the Columbus beer, dry hop beer, really had a lot more of that hop character come through than what the Cascade did.
Wow. I just wonder if alpha acid has an impact in that way.
Yeah, and I guess it'd be interesting to see maybe if we would repeat this, if we could get the same hops with the same alpha acid levels, what would happen if we took the high alpha acid level hops, the Columbus in this case, and maybe reduce the dry hopping time in half. Mm-hmm. So 2-day dry hop for the high alpha acid hop and a 4 or 5 day dry hop for the Cascade or the lower alpha acid hop.
Well, it sounds like a fun experiment, and the funnest part is that you had a lot of beer to drink. Or not all at once, of course, but you had a lot of beer to enjoy. Let's say that.
There you go.
And it wasn't one of these experiments where you try a variable that's going to ruin part of the beer the part of the batch of beer. So it sounds like it was a winner all around.
It was so much that we were excited after this first test to try something else, and that kind of led to the next thing that we brewed just about a month back, I guess. But yeah, it definitely it didn't satisfy the curiosity, I guess, and it's got us a little bit hungry for what else can we do and what else can we find out from doing similar experiments like this, because like you said, these aren't just kind of a test and throw away. You get to enjoy the beer for at least as long as you can keep it in your basement.
And what was the sequel? What was the next experiment?
The next experiment was a lager, my first lager, which we did with a American Pilsner. So,
and I think there was two reasons why we chose that one. One, actually probably three reasons now that I think about it. One, we wanted a good summer beer. We wanted something that we maybe can get some of the non-good beer drinkers to try. And I think coming out of this experiment, being somewhat surprised with the different impacts the yeast had, given how similar the yeast were, we really kind of wanted to isolate the yeast and see how we could further show the differentiation between the yeast strains. And so the natural choice, at least in our minds, was to pick a very clean beer, the American Pils, because as we started thinking back to what we did with this APA, yes, we saw some significant differences in flavor given the two yeast strains, but we also have, given the grist bill and just the sheer amount of hops in there, we also felt like we could be muting some of the really true flavors or impact that the yeast strain had. So it kind of evolved again, just that the Pils was a pretty good choice for that, given how clean a Pils should be. So we wanted something that wasn't quite as hoppy, didn't have quite as complex of a grist bill, so we could really take a look at what the yeast do. And what we ended up doing was same setup, except we used 3 different yeast on this one. So we didn't need as a control for each dry hop because we were no longer dry hopping. So it opened up the door for one more test condition, which was, in our case, an additional yeast strain.
Wow. So we used 3 different yeast strains for this due to, as I said, I don't have starter capability, because I just don't have a stir plate. So we went to the brew store and we could only find so many packets of yeast So we had 2 brew stores up and found 3 yeasts that we thought would work. We used the WLP 800 Pilsner Lager yeast from White Labs, and then we used a 2001 Pils from Y Yeast, the Smack Pack, and then the third yeast was the 2000 Budvar Lager yeast. So those are the 3 yeasts we have now. They've been going about 1 month now.
And we did overpitch these, given that Darren would refuse to do a starter unless he had a stir plate. We'd take multiple packs or vials to pitch into each test condition to try to help with that or delay the lag time that we would see given the cold fermentation that we were going to put it through.
Well, I hope that you'll share the results of that with me when it gets finished, and if it's worthwhile, maybe we can get back together again.
Sure,
that'd be great.
Well, this has been fun, guys, and I'm inspired, and I hope that that will inspire other people to do experiments of their own. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again to Jim and Darren. I look forward to hearing how their lager experiment comes out. And maybe this will inspire you to take part in the Basic Brewing Radio Brew Your Own experiment, too. It's fun to play with your beer, and you get interesting results sometimes. Remember, we've got the Brewer's Logbook and our new Basic Winemaking Introduction to Wine Kits DVD out there in our online store. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. On our site, you can check out our other DVDs as well, our Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing DVD, our Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, and our Stepping into All Grain to help you learn new techniques. We've got combo deals to save you a few bucks if you want to buy more than one DVD at a time, and you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com, and I'll put it in a box myself and send it out to you. And we've got shirts that people are ordering to get ready for the warmer weather here in the northern hemisphere. And thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Magic Pickle versus the Egg Poacher. And, Bayou Classic 1060 60-quart stainless fryer/steamer with vented lid. Wow. You can brew some beer in that. Thanks again, everybody. Remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. And we appreciate your support. Well, that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson, the ever-patient Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.